thank you so much for coming, I really appreciate it. And Sam, thank you for coming, really appreciate it. Give a round of applause.
Don't think I'll sit down because I need to be able to look at my own slides, but I didn't realize quite how big and positioned behind me the slides were going to be when I was building them, so apologies if the text is monstrously large, but welcome to the session. We're going to be talking about outlining. Dominic was right about that. He was not correct about me coming to Bournemouth just for this, despite the fact that I am from the US. I've been a Bournemouth local for about 7.5 years. He's got a lot of speakers on this weekend, so we'll give it to him. Yeah, I've been in Bournemouth for about 7.5 years. I was at the festival last year as an attendee and really excited to be part of it this year. Importantly, while I am an author, I also worked at HarperCollins from 2015 to 2018 in various capacities, full-time in person and then remotely as a freelancer in both editorial and marketing. And as an author, my books have sold about 100,000 copies. It's actually like 98,000, but 100,000 sounds better, so we're leaving it at that next slide. Thank you very much. By the way, if I speak really quickly, apologies, that's just how I naturally speak. I will be providing the slides after this. I'll give you a link and a giant QR code at the end where you can get the slides and the templates we're going to go through. But if I'm just speaking way too fast, just feel free to raise your hand and tell me to slow down. These are my books. I write rom-coms. Very excited to be putting out my third book, You've Got Chainmail, on the 15th of August. That's coming out with HarperCollins UK, as my other two books did as well. It's coming out in August. That's all I'm going to say about that. Save some time. Let's talk about what we're going to go through today. We're going to talk a little bit about why we're here, why I am really passionate about this subject, why this is something that I feel I can talk to you about. And when it comes to outlining, we're going to talk a lot about how outlining is going to become more and more important throughout your career as an author. So once you're past that debut phase, why is outlining so important and what is the role that it's going to play? Because it's very different than when you're writing your first project or before you have entered into a commercial publishing relationship. We're going to talk about the function of that outline for the different people you'll encounter in that process. We'll talk about what makes a good outline and how to find your perfect outline structure as advertised in the title of the session. But not just in general for you as an author, but for each individual project, because each project is going to be different and should be treated as such. I'm going to show you in my upcoming novel how I approached that, what were some of the outlining processes that I went through for that. And like I said, I will be providing these slides and some templates for you at the end to hopefully give you something tangible you can take away and go through this exercise yourself. Quick note on traditional versus self-publishing, agented versus unagented. There's a lot of distinctions in the process, whether you are traditionally published or self-published, whether you have an agent or don't have an agent. We're not going to get really in the weeds in that today, because actually the things we're going to talk about today are true regardless of where you sit within that. I am traditionally published. I am unagented. I work directly with my publishers. People who are self-published, this is going to apply to you as well, or who want to be self-published. People who are agented, this is also going to apply, and your agent is going to take on some of the role of the editor in that situation when you're working with them. So I might use terms like editor that might apply to different people, or even yourself if you're self-published, throughout the process. So don't get too hung up on the terminology there. Think of it more as the function that we're talking about. So I'm going to ask you a question. Are you a plotter or a pantser? And if you have not heard these terms before, a plotter is someone who likes to plan everything out, maybe ad nauseum, but really likes to have all of the details figured out ahead of time. And the pantser is someone who likes to fly by the seat of their pants. So they like to really figure it out as they go. So hands up, who is naturally a plotter? Okay, exciting. And who is naturally a pantser? I'll put both my hands up for that one. I am such a pantser by nature. Whether you're a plotter or a pantser, outlining is incredibly important. It's going to come more naturally to those of you who are plotters, but it's still important to understand how to do it effectively. Otherwise, you can get carried away and buried in the process. But it's also very important to those of us who are pantsers because it doesn't come as naturally. And so having a structure we can rely on is very helpful. So why do I want to talk about this? Like I said, I've been on both sides of the process. I am an author. I do work with my publisher directly on commissioned projects, and so that's very important, but I also have been on the other side. I've been in editorial, having to work with authors on their outlines, on their finished manuscripts, and seen all of the stuff that happens behind the scenes with that outline ahead of time. And like I said, as an author, I've struggled with outlining. It's not in my nature, and it took me a really long time to get to the point that I'm happy with my process. I have shared this method with other people as well, and it's worked for them. I'm in a very, very large writing group, and I was happy to share this ahead of time with some of them so that they could test it out on some of their projects, and it worked really well for them. I've got some people I'm still in touch with from my creative writing MA that I did back in 2015, and it's worked really well for them as well, so I'm excited to share it with you today. Outlines are not just a plotting tool. It's really important to think of outlines not just as a way to structure your thoughts at the beginning of the process, but as something that's going to serve as a scaffolding for you throughout the entire writing journey, including editing. They become a lot more important as well for subsequent books. How many of you are working on your debut at the moment, or you're working on your first project, or you've yet to be published? Yeah? So that's a lot of you. So right now, you might be thinking about outlining as something that's going to help you with that initial project. But getting outlining right is going to be even more important as you move throughout your career. My personal relationship with outlining, like I said, I've always pantsed it when I've been writing for myself until I started being published. And then what I did was I overcorrected, and I would start outlining to the point that I would paint myself into a corner. And that is the worst thing that can happen to a pantser, is you outline to the point that you've answered all of the questions and there's no creative curiosity driving you forward anymore. And that was really challenging because it meant that getting through those projects was a bit of a slog. And now, over 6 outlining processes later, and I say over 6 because I'm in the middle of number 7, I have finally found my perfect method that, like I said, has worked for some other people. But your debut is the most freedom that you are ever going to have as an author. You will have had years to work on your debut. And then you're gonna sell that debut, you're gonna get yourself an agent, and your agent's gonna sell it to a publisher, and they're gonna say, that's great. Not only do we love it and wanna publish it, we also want another book from you. And you know when you're gonna have to deliver that book? A year later. And that book is gonna have to be signed off in theory. The idea of it is going to need to be signed off before you start working on it. And that is where outlining comes into play. So remember how I talked about overcorrecting and outlining to too much of an extent? The problem is I was being too prescriptive with myself. And the problem with being too prescriptive, and what we're gonna avoid and what we're talking about today, is that sometimes you really do have to write your way into things. Even for those of you who are plotters, there are probably things that you don't really know about the story until you get into actually writing it. There are things that you might think that you know, and then when you start writing, you realize that actually it's working out slightly differently than you'd initially pictured. Additionally, like I said, that lack of curiosity can really zap your creative momentum. If you don't feel creatively curious, what's motivating you to sit down and write? And you also don't want to set expectations you can't meet. Like I said, we're talking a lot today about how important outlines are for that collaboration with your publisher, with your agent. If you outline too prescriptively, and then you end up doing things slightly differently, it can create a tension of, hey, I know I said I was gonna do it this way, but now I'm gonna do it this way. And that's fine to an extent. There's always a little bit of give and take within the plans that you put forward. But if it's everything, if everything is changing because it wasn't outlined in an effective way, then that can cause too much tension. A good outline is a trellis, not a funnel. So the purpose of an outline is not to point you in a very specific direction and force you to go there. An outline is a trellis that the organic thing that is your story can grow onto. It is a structure, it is a framework. It is not forcing your hand. And good outline is going to facilitate collaboration. We're going to come to exactly what that means in a minute, what all those people involved in the process are going to do with your outline once you've created it. It's going to facilitate positioning. It's going to facilitate your focus and your creativity. So what happens behind the scenes, right? When you've delivered your debut, they're taking that out into the world and they say, all right, time for you to start working on book 2. And you deliver your outline. What happens with that outline? What are they doing? They're starting on the package. And your package is not just your cover, it's also your title, it's also your blurb, it's also the similar titles or comps that they compare it to, the positioning within the market, where it's gonna sit on the shelves. They're determining that sometimes from the outline. You might have a genre that you write within, but there are subgenres within every single genre. And they're determining that positioning, which is in turn gonna determine marketing budget and the approach that they take. Those marketing strategies, including what advanced readers they're gonna submit to, what authors they're gonna send it to so that they can hopefully get a quote for the front of your book. All of that's being decided from the outline. And then of course, distribution and rights strategies. For me, because I work directly with my publisher, they do that internally. If you work with an agent, your agent is going to be taking your book as soon as you've sold it to your key publisher. They're going to be taking it to foreign publishers. They're going to be taking it to film and TV agents, all of that. All of that is happening sometimes from your outline. I say sometimes because the film and TV stuff a lot of times doesn't happen until you have a finished manuscript. But the rest of this is happening from your outline. I say outline, as I was just talking about earlier, a lot of times publishers will ask you for a synopsis, right? Did anyone go to the synopsis session earlier today? Yeah.
I want to go, but I wouldn't go.
There you go. I wanted to go as well, but I had a conflicting session, so I need to try to get some notes off of somebody. But some editors will ask you for a synopsis. That's basically just an outline that has been turned into paragraph form, right? So we're talking about those two things interchangeably here. That is going to inform all of this. Your editors in particular are going to be looking at your genre and subgenre. They're going to be looking to understand what your hook is and to be able to trust that you understand what your hook is. Does everyone know what a hook means? Yeah? No? So your hook is the thing that makes your story unique. It is the one sentence descriptor that contains the information that a reader is going to use to identify your book amongst all the other similar books within that subgenre, right? It's the kind of thing that goes right at the top of your blurb when you're writing that. An editor needs to know that you understand what the hook of your book is and that they're going to be able to lean into it when you're drafting. If they don't feel like they can see that from your outline, then they're probably going to make you go back to the drawing board. They're probably going to say, we need a little something else from this. They're also going to be looking at pacing. They're going to want to be able to see that you know what you're doing in terms of causality within the book, that your readers are going to be moving quickly from one thing to the next and moving seamlessly from one thing to the next. I'll give you an example. My book that's coming out in August is 117,000 words. That is long for a rom-com. But the pacing, I've been told, is very good, and that has been the case since the outline stage. Because of this method, I was able to figure out the causality and make it so that as a reader, they are going through and things are clearly moving from one thing to the next. It doesn't feel like it's slogging. It doesn't feel like anything isn't serving a purpose. So that pacing is something they're going to be looking for. They're also going to be looking at comps. They're going to look at your outline and they're going to try to use that as a basis for figuring out what similar titles exist in the marketplace. They're going to be looking at any topics that they can use to market that. For example, the end of the book is set at a Renaissance fair in the US. That is a heavy part of the marketing for them. It's not, the genre of my book by any stretch, but it's an important part of the story for them from a marketing perspective. And they're also going to be looking at timeline confidence, and this one is really, really important because like I said, those timelines are tight. Your debut you took years on probably. Your second book they're going to want really quickly after that. And the outline and how clear and focused it is going to give them the confidence that you can deliver within the timeline that they've set out for you. If they don't see a cohesive outline, if they don't feel like you know what you're doing from that outline, then they might be like, oh, I don't know about this pub date. We might be thinking about pushing that back. And that lack of momentum can, again, cause friction and tension within the publishing relationship. Your marketers are going to need some very similar things. They're going to need to know tone, So for example, my rom-com, it's a rom-com, it's very lighthearted rather than being like a dark romance. And so the package is gonna look very differently than if it were a dark romance. They're gonna be looking again at comps, any topics or tropes that they can use to market. And they're gonna be looking at the level of commercial appeal, which is going to inform their distribution strategies and the conversations they're gonna start having with booksellers. And then there's what you need, which is, arguably the most important thing. What do you need out of an outline? You need to use it to help you understand the overall structure of your book. How are you going to approach structuring that in terms of points of view, in terms of different parts of the book, your setting, things like that. Your key plot points, that one's quite obvious. Your main character motivations, we're going to talk about character arc in a minute, but you at least need to know who your main characters are and what they want in order to get started. It's also going to help you validate your ideas. As we're going to talk about in a minute, we're going to use some established story structures to start off our outlining journey. And when you're able to fit your ideas into established story structures, it really validates, oh, yeah, this idea is actually a story, right? It's not just an idea that excites me as a person, it's actually a story. It's actually a narrative that I can use to engage people. And similarly, confidence that you're working on something publishable, because pretty much everything that gets published is going to be able to fit into some of these established story structures. I'm gonna have to say those words a lot, and it's a bit of a tongue twister, so sorry if I slow down a bit when I'm saying those. If you are self-publishing, if you are self-published or you want to be self-published, all of this still applies. Because while you might work with editors, you might work with marketing professionals, ultimately those things that we said editors and marketers need, you're the one that needs to be doing those things. You're the one that needs to be finding your comps. You're the one that needs to be art directing your cover. You're the one that needs to be creating your blurb or overseeing the creation of your blurb. So what having an outline ahead of time does for you is it allows you to work on those things at the same time, in parallel. And as we're gonna come to in a minute, I'm gonna share some first-party research. Sounds very fancy. I'm gonna share some first-party research with you about how authors are actually approaching that, including self-published authors, and they are using their outlines to get started on those activities before they've actually written the books. Because you think that traditional publishing timelines are tight for subsequent books, self-published authors write so quickly, and it is very impressive. I don't know how they do it. So self-publishing, all of this still applies. So how well is this working for real-life career authors, right? A friend of mine in the US and I did a study, and by study I mean a survey, that was sent out to thousands of writers, and we got nearly 800 respondents, 691 of which were valid for the purpose of what we wanted to analyze, which was for people who have published 2 or more books and are doing some form of outlining. How are they approaching it, and how satisfied are they with their approaches, right? You can see they're 41% in the UK, so very relevant to this audience here. Also 41% traditionally published, 43% self-published, 16% identified as indie published, which means different things to different people, but that was how it was phrased. How useful do these people find their outlines? 50% said that they don't touch their outline after draft 1. So they use their outline as a way to get their thoughts organized, and then they draft, and their outline is never to be seen again. 36% say they do outlining at every stage. And every stage here, it wasn't worded super specifically within the question, but it would be assumed to mean when you're doing your drafting, when you're doing your edits, when you're doing your structural edits, when you're doing all of that. So any big edit is gonna have outlining that goes along with it. And 14% say they only revisit their outlines for really, really big edits or if they're stuck. In terms of consistency, 91% say they use the same method for every single book. We'll talk in a minute about what those methods are. 9% said that they switch things up based on the project's needs. So we know that humans are creatures who love familiarity, right? So 91% are sticking with what they know. However, this is what they're using. 16% say that they are adhering strictly to an established story structure, which we're going to go over a few of those in a minute. 49% say that they start from those established structures, but then they take lots of liberties as they go, as they build. We're going to do that. 13% say that they use their own structure, something that they've come up with for themselves, and 22% say that they just freestyle them, right? That's their method that they use, is they just freestyle it. 98% of traditionally or indie published respondents say that outlining is important to collaboration with their publisher. 98%. That is really important. That's kind of the premise of what we're talking about, right? Is that outlining isn't just important for you. It's important for everyone in that process. And 98% of career authors who are working with an external publisher agree with that statement. 55% of self-published respondents say that they're using their outlines to start the production and marketing processes before they're done drafting. So just over half. So it's maybe less applicable to self-published, but it is still more than half of them are using the same approach. How satisfied are they with this though? 3% of authors say that they're completely satisfied with their outlining approach. That's not very many. 11% say that they're happy with their initial outlines for drafting purposes, but they wish that their outlines supported them better throughout their process. 31% feel their outlines could better support them during drafting. So not just they're not supporting them during edits, they're not even supporting them well during that initial drafting phase. And 55% feel their outlining process is useful only to organize their thoughts before drafting, right? That's not useful. That's not useful to you, right? It means that maybe you're able to give your publishers and your marketers what they need, but you're not getting what you need from that, because an outline is meant to help you throughout your process. So what does all of that actually mean for you? Almost all career authors recognize the importance of an outline for early stage activity. And that's not just your early stage activity, that's that early stage collaboration as well, right? But very few are creating outlines that support them throughout the writing process. Your outline is the backbone of your story. And think about your actual physical backbone right now. You are a full human. If I took away your backbone, you'd kind of fall apart, right? It's not something that goes away after the initial moment. It's something that's meant to support you and support your story as you go. Is a reader ever going to see it? No. But it's still there to support your process for fleshing things out. So, let's look at some popular outline structures. Established story structures, as I said. Raise your hand if you've heard of any of these. Hero's Journey, anyone? Yeah? Most people have heard of at least one of these. These are some of the most popular story structures. And I say story structures, it says outline structures at the top, but really these are story structures. These are not just for outlining novels, right? The story spine, this is what Pixar uses to plan all of their films, right? Any idea that comes forward within Pixar, they're like, does it fit into this structure? If not, it needs to go back to the drawing board. So these are very, very well established structures. These are really helpful to you for a few reasons. First of all, when you try to use established story structures, they force focus. Because a lot of times when you start outlining, you just start brain dumping all the ideas that you have, all the things you would want to achieve. But these established story structures force focus, and they force you to think about what is it that each of these ideas, each of these scenes that you're envisioning, each of these interactions that you're concocting, what are they achieving within the story? What are they actually doing for the narrative? They give you language for what you're trying to achieve or communicate. An example of that, I think it's from Save the Cat originally, but the phrase Dark Night of the Soul. If anyone's ever heard that, that just clicked for me. When I heard that for the first time, I was like, I know exactly what that means in a story. I know exactly what part of the story that's about. And now when I outline, I use that. I use the phrasing, the Dark Night of the Soul, because it makes sense and I understand what that's doing within the narrative. So it's giving us language for what we want to achieve. It makes us think about causality and progress. Again, your brain dump of ideas is great, but how is it moving people through the story? How is it progressing the narrative? How is it making it so that readers feel like they're on a journey and not just seeing these little vignettes that are teaching them something. And they're based on millennia of storytelling tradition. The hero's journey in particular, and all of the derivatives that come from it, that is the crux of most stories that you will see. Most stories you will be able to deconstruct and put into the hero's journey in one way or another. That said, every story is different. And I don't just mean every writer is different, I mean every story is different. Every story that you write will be different and will lean towards some of these structures and away from others. It will lend itself well to some language and less well to other language when you're trying to categorize it, when you're trying to explain it. So while the established story structures are helpful, they can sometimes be too prescriptive or not relevant enough for us. So let me tell you about how I approached this in my book that's coming out in August. This is the timeline for me for publishing. So the idea was agreed with my publisher on the 22nd of August. Ooh, there you go, got a little laser pointer. That section right there, that was my outlining. That's all the time I had for outlining. I spent 4 months drafting, spent 7 weeks in structural edits, and I spent about 4 weeks in my line edit and proofread. I just finished that. I'm very excited. That's not very long. That's not very long to do all of that. So I needed to be able to lean on a method that I had developed, that I knew I could rely on. It's a very quick turnaround. My structural edit down there in January to March, it was a big structural edit. I changed a lot of stuff about the story because we decided to change the positioning slightly. One of the characters changed quite fundamentally as a result. So that was a very big edit. I'm now going through the outlining process for the next book, which is very exciting. But what that meant is that I really put this method to the test. Why this worked, why the outlining method worked, they could start on the packaging without the manuscript. I showed you that cover at the beginning. They started on that way before last week when we signed off the proofread, right? If we waited for a finished manuscript, there's no way I could have had a custom illustrated cover in time for an August publication. It just wouldn't have happened. I also felt supported by my outline without feeling pigeonholed. I was able to go through the process and feel like I knew what I needed to be achieving next without feeling like I painted myself into a corner. I also knew that I had buy-in from my editorial team on the overall direction of the book. That's really important. When you're trying to be a career author, it can be really hard to be like, do they actually like this idea? Are they actually gonna want to sell this idea? Are they actually gonna put marketing budget behind this idea? And when you have an outline that covers all those important things, you can confidently get that buy-in. And therefore, they were able to articulate to me which parts were most important and interesting to them. So for example, in the first draft of my outline, the Ren Fair was a much smaller part of it. And we made it a much bigger part because I said that'll be fun for marketing. So more of the story happens around that now. Additionally, and this is just a little bit of a side note, but shows you the kinds of things that can be facilitated. I have some stuff in my book around copyrighted materials, specifically the characters play Dungeons and Dragons, and that is intellectual property owned by Hasbro, who are very litigious sometimes. So the legal team at HarperCollins was able to validate my approach while I didn't have the actual text, and they are now validating the actual text. They were able to validate my approach to using that copyrighted material so that I could do that confidently. Because imagine if I'd written a whole book based on that, and then they were like, wish you'd run this by us first, right? Because that's not gonna work. Quick note on multi-point of view stories. So multi-POV being when you have multiple characters who have points of view within the story. This applies to my book that's coming out in August, and you'll see why I want to touch on this before we start going through the actual structures. Every point of view character needs a character arc, but not a story arc. These are two very distinct things, right? Every character needs to go from who they are at the beginning of the book to who they are at the end of the book. But when we start looking at story arcs, if you're thinking to yourself, God, I've got 3 main characters, am I gonna have to do this for every single character? No. You don't need to do this outlining for every single character. Your reader is experiencing the story as one narrative. One narrative. No matter how many points of view there are, they are all contributing to a single narrative. So your outline is about your narrative, not about each individual character. I mean, you can certainly do it for your characters if you want to, but it's also important that you do it for your story as a whole. Once you have figured out what your story structure is going to be, once you have outlined, try not to add beats if you don't have to, right? Try not to add new story beats once you've figured out what you want just to cover off another point of view. Try to see if you can cover off all of those point of view character arcs within your existing beats. And again, that's going to be to do with pacing, right? If a reader's reading a story and they have to experience the same story beat twice because they need to service multiple character arcs, that's going to feel slow to the reader. And so it's important for being concise and keeping pace that you are trying to cover off all of those character arcs that you want to achieve within the story beats that you come up with as part of this outlining process. To help with that, it's also important as we start to look at the structures in a second to remember that beats do not equal chapters. Okay, beats don't equal chapters, they don't equal scenes. You might cover off multiple story beats within a single chapter if you've got multiple scenes. You might take multiple chapters to cover off a single story beat. I have this happen multiple times within my book because I need that same beat covered from multiple character perspectives, but it's the same story beat. Okay, and that's gonna make a little bit more sense when we look at the templates in a second. So let's talk about the method, right? Been a little bit theoretical up until now. Let's get really practical. How are you gonna outline? How are you gonna start? You're gonna do some optional pre-work. I'll come to what that means in a second. Then we're gonna do what's called progressive outlining. We're gonna take some of these established story structures and we're gonna speed run them. Then you're gonna create what I call the Franken outline. So Frankenstein reference, lots of outlines combined. Then you're gonna structure for success and you're gonna revisit your outline regularly. So let's talk about what that pre-work is. If you are a plotter and you really like to know every single thing about your characters, you can snowflake method to your heart's content. That can be some of your pre-work. You can do timeline mapping, things like that. These are not essential to be done before you start your progressive outlining, okay? Your progressive outlining is gonna answer all the questions that are needed for the story beats. But if you want to do some of that character development ahead of time, it's absolutely great. I personally don't like to know exactly what my character arcs are gonna look like before I start writing. That's one thing that I feel like I have to let myself discover during the drafting process. But if you wanna know that ahead of time, you go for it. Depending on the genre that you write, there might be pre-work that you have to do. If you're writing mystery, you absolutely need to be mapping out your clues, your suspects, things like that. If you're writing fantasy, you need to do some world building. If you're writing historical fiction, you need to do some time and place research, right? There is a lot of that you might have to do ahead of time, but that's kind of research and ideation. That's not structuring an actual narrative, okay? So that's the difference with this pre-work. None of this is like actually structuring a narrative. It's just your supporting materials, whatever you feel you need to do to make that happen. Then we're gonna get to progressive outlining. Like I said, this is essentially speed running a bunch of different established story structures. And you're gonna start with your one-page method, which I've got templates for this that we'll click through in a second and I'll provide to you afterwards, so it'll make more sense when you see that. But this is essentially a brain dump where you get to put in all of the fun ideas that you have. It forces a little bit of clarity in terms of you have to say who your main characters are, what the starting image is, what the closing image is, what your crescendo is, but the rest of it is just bullet points. It's just, what do I want to do? What's a cool thing? If I'm, coming up with a rom-com, maybe I really want there to be a funny meet the parents scene in here. I really want there to be a, oh, there's only one bed trope, that kind of thing. You can put all of those fun ideas into your one-page method brain dump. Then you're gonna do the story spine. This is that Pixar method that we talked about, which is a very, very simple, once upon a time, this was the case, and then, and then, and then, and finally. And that's gonna force you to take some of your brain dump and organize it into a structure. Then we've got the 3-act structure and the 4-act structure. If you've not heard of these before, again, you'll see them in a second. People tend to prefer one or the other. I find it's important to go through both for each story. I've had some stories that I've outlined that lend themselves better to the 3-act structure, and some that lend better to the 4-act structure. It really just depends. Sometimes it's just how you feel like articulating it. It's useful to do both, because the point of this is not that we're going to use all of these. The point of this is that it's getting us to think about the story in different ways, according to different structures, in order to support the Franken outline that we'll create in the next step. Then you're going to use Dan Harmon's story circle, which is a simplified version of the hero's journey that I think has been updated well for modern times. And then you're going to do Save the Cat. Who here's heard of Save the Cat? Yeah? It's a screenwriting story technique that has been very lovingly adopted by writers, by novelists. And then you're going to do one called Take Off Your Pants. This is not an instruction. You can do this with or without pants in the comfort of your own home. But there's a wonderful book by a woman named Libby Hawker called Take Off Your Pants. Pants referring to being a pantser. So the idea that you're turning pantsers into plotters with this method. This is a very detailed, by the point we get to Take Off Your Pants, this is a very detailed story structure. There are lots of beats within this. So what you're doing as you go through this, I'll get my fancy laser app again. As you're going through this, and then here, you're getting progressively more detailed. You're taking more and more from your brain dump. You're adding more and more as you're thinking about that causality, as you're thinking about how things move from one thing to the next within the story, and you're getting more detailed, more fleshed out. Then you're going to do any genre-based derivatives, right? So I'm a romance author. There's a wonderful Save the Cat derivative called Romancing the Beat that I like to use. If you write thrillers, there's also a Save the Cat derivative called Thriller Beats. There's lots of different genre-specific stuff that you can use. If you're writing literary fiction, or if you're writing just sort of generalist fiction, you may not feel the need to take this step, and that's fine. But if you're writing a commercial genre, I would encourage you to find a genre-specific outline structure that you can experiment with at this stage. Again, you don't have to use this, but experiment with it, because it will help you understand how your story ideas do or do not fit within the conventions of the genre. And that is going to be important to your publisher. If you can't fit it into that genre-based derivative of one of these structures, then it may be that it's not fitting well within that genre or that subgenre, or maybe it is, but it's very subversive, and your publisher needs to know that so that they can position it correctly. So it's important to experiment with these if they exist. Just do a Google, see what you can come up with. And then you're going to create your Franken outline. So what is a Franken outline? Oh no, we're going to look at the templates first. So let's have a look. Ta-da! So you're going to have access to these at the end, but this is a template that you can use. And you can see here you've got the one-page method. You've got the story spine, which, as I said, is just sort of every day, but one day because of that. And you've got an example story in here because of that. So again, forcing you to think about causality until finally, and ever since then. Then you've got the 3-act structure, which is 3 acts, each broken down into 3 beats. You've got the 4-act structure, which is a little bit looser, but also has some key beats within it. I've got a standard version of the hero's journey in there for you, as well as Dan Harmon's story circle. You've got Save the Cat in there as well. And then I've got Romancing the Beat in there just because that's my genre-based derivative, but obviously you replace that with whatever is appropriate to you. You've got Take Off Your Pants, which you can see here. Look how detailed that is. Look how many beats are in this outline compared to that Pixar method at the beginning, right? You've got all kinds of stuff that you're doing within this outline. You're breaking it down into sort of sub-beats. That kind of detail was nowhere in those first few passes. And this is why we do this progressively, so that you're getting more and more detail as you go. So, like I said, these templates are going to be available to you after the fact, but You can use these, you can put them into whatever you use. You can download this as a Word document, you can use it in Google Docs, you can put it in Scrivener or whatever it is that you use for what you do. But that progressive outlining is going to get you to the point that you have as much detail as you need to start to put together your Franken outline. Yeah, so this is forcing you to expand in a story-focused way. When you start small, when you start with that sort of Pixar method, it's forcing that clarity that you need. You'll be surprised, and this is back to that every project is different, you'll be surprised which story structures resonate that maybe haven't in the past, right? I really struggled with Save the Cat for a long time, and then when I was doing my most recent book, all of a sudden Save the Cat just made sense. Like, it just worked for that story in a way that it hadn't worked for any stories before. If something's not working, you can always walk it back a step, right? Because we're getting progressively more complex. So you can always walk it back a step and see, have I messed something up here, or is it just that this structure is not resonating? And it allows you to sort of review that level of detail. So then we get to the Franken outline, which is a fun step. And what you're gonna do there is you're gonna beg, borrow, and steal from all of those established story structures that we just looked at. You're gonna take the general structure and the general order and keep it the same, but you're gonna take the language and the specifics of the beats that work best for you, that make the most sense, and you're going to combine them into a big outline. Don't stray too far from what you found helpful. Don't go like making up your own terms for things. Try to use what it is that you found helpful about those existing structures, but just combine them, bring them together. As well, make sure you include everything your editors and marketers need. So once you've gone through and you've combined it, go back to those lists. What does your editor need? What does your marketer need? If that's covered off within your story structure, great. If it's not, add some bullet points to the top or the bottom, or make sure that you add it in where it's appropriate within that story structure to make sure that they have what they need. Then if you're writing a synopsis, you can use that as the basis for your synopsis. If you're just working with an outline, this is now your outline that you use for things. So let's look at an example of this. This is my dining room wall a few months ago. You can see here that I've mapped out not only all of the beats, here's a beat, here's a beat, here's a beat, but I've got 2 point of view characters. So you've got one point of view character in yellow, one point of view character in blue. And you can sort of see here, like I said earlier, we've got scenes that are covering off multiple story beats. And then we've got some story beats where I need multiple scenes because I've got multiple points of view that I need to cover off within that. But I've not added new beats just for the sake of those points of view, right? I've added the points of view into that structure that I came up with that made sense for my story so that I was able to plot it out accordingly. Let's break that down into what those actual beats were, right? Because you just saw a little glimpse of some of those structures. There are a lot of these, so I'm just gonna go through them. So this was the first half of it. So you've got intro, meet cute, character realizes external goal, adhesion plot thrust, display of flaw, drive for goal. This is an interesting one because that sounds like 2 different beats, right? And I took that language from story structures that were using these as 2 different beats, but for the purpose of my story, these were the same thing. They were happening at the same time. Because of the ideas that I had and the characters that I was working with, these were both on display and both being covered off at the same time. So these were combined into one beat for my Franken outline. Revisiting flaw, new drive for goal, thwart number 2. Revisiting flaw, inkling this could work, deepening desire. All of this. A lot of mine is borrowed from romancing the beat. A lot of mine is borrowed from Take Off Your Pants. Take Off Your Pants in particular has this nice thwart, new drive for goal kind of pattern to it. Thwart, new drive for goal, thwart, new drive for goal that I find really useful for establishing that pacing. And in fact, a lot of that book, Take Off Your Pants, is about pacing in particular. So a lot of this is borrowed from that. Then a lot of the really romance specific sounding stuff, like the midpoint of love, plot thrust, or what wholehearted looks like, that's taken from my genre-based derivative because that language makes sense for me, for the story that I'm writing. but it's still within those standard story structures. So this was my Franken outline. This is what I was able to create. Once you've got your Franken outline, then you're going to structure for success, which means that you're going to create yourself a template. Who here writes in like Google Docs or Word, some sort of word processor, and who uses Scrivener? I use Scrivener or NovelPad or something similar. Regardless of what you use, you're going to create yourself a template, right? Where each section is going to be one of the beats from your Franken outline. And you're going to make your plot points from within your outline available within that template, right? So you might have a section that is titled Midpoint of Love Plot Thrust, and then some bullet points of what's happening within that. And that's what you can use for your drafting, because it keeps it top of mind what you're using or what you're trying to achieve within the section that you're working on. Remember, beats and outline points don't necessarily equal chapters. So when you're setting things up within your tool of choice, this doesn't necessarily have to be your chapter headings. You can set it up in whatever way makes sense for you, but most of those options will have like a section function that you can use that might make this a little bit easier so that you can have multiple scenes or multiple chapters within the story beats as needed. And then you're going to revisit your outline, right? So every time that you finish your manuscript and you go, okay, time to edit, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go back to your outline, right? You're going to go back to your outline, you're going to read through it, you can tweak it based on anything that has changed since the last time you looked at it, and you're going to refamiliarize yourself with your outline before you start reading. And the reason you're going to do that is so that you are able to adequately assess if your manuscript is achieving what you set out in your outline, right? If you never look at your outline again, it's really hard to lose that perspective and lose that bearing. Otherwise, you're just assessing it based off of, is it better than the previous version? Which hopefully the answer is always going to be yes, but actually you should be judging it against the North Star of your outline, which is what you have used to achieve buy-in for what you're working on. Revisiting when you're making big story decisions. If you get stuck, get writer's block, go back to your outline. Say, what am I trying to achieve right now? How does it fit into the big picture? If I change this, what impact does that have on the rest of my story beats? Because otherwise it's really easy to just get lost in the word processor and make decisions based on what feels right in that moment, but aren't necessarily right within the context of your story. You can revise your outline as needed as you're drafting. If you're making big changes to it, it's worth having those conversations with an agent if you have one, or if you've got a touch point scheduled with your editor, maybe save up some of those questions for your editor. Try not to make a ton of changes and then not tell your editor about them until the end. If you find that you're having to tweak it quite a lot, maybe schedule in a touch point, because again, that is what has been used to create that buy-in. But that doesn't mean that this has to never change once you've done it the first time, because like we said at the very beginning, sometimes you gotta write your way into things. Any questions? Not all at once, guys. Yes?
How long do you expect this process to take?
How long do you expect this process to take? That depends entirely on you. I know I joked that that's like speed running, all of that, but I don't recommend doing it all at once. My personal preference is if I've got to do some outlining in a week, I'll do one of those structures a day, because then it gives me time to sort of think about it before I come back to it and sort of sit with it, and I'll reevaluate what I did before I start on the next one. That excludes that one-page method at the beginning, which is kind of your brain dump, which I kind of do from the moment I have the idea. I might start that before I've even discussed that idea with my publisher, because that's just kind of where I'm keeping all of my ideas about the story. It kind of depends on how far along you are in the process. I have done this all in a day before, and it worked fine. I had a product that I could share with my publisher, but it's hard, and sometimes you lose that context, right? You need to be able to step away and reflect on it and be like, what am I actually wanting to achieve? Whereas again, if you're trying to do it all at once, sometimes it's just iterating on what came before rather than actually having the context of what am I trying to achieve, which you get the benefit of if you reflect in between the progressive outlines. Yeah, and then the drafting process and then revisiting it throughout the drafting and editing process obviously takes as long as drafting and editing takes for that particular project. For me, the drafting process was about 4 months, and then that's when I next revisited my outline from a do I want to change anything perspective, but for some people it might be a shorter amount of time or a longer amount of time. Yes.
So I know you mentioned thank you, that was amazing. I'm so excited now.
Thanks.
I like that I might be
I'm
able
glad
to
you're
like, move
happy.
forward. Seriously, that's fantastic. So you mentioned multi-point view.
Yes.
Any thoughts or suggestions on dual point of view? Like would I do an outline for each, like an outline for each character?
No, so when I say multi-POV, that includes dual
Oh,
POV.
okay.
So my book that's coming out is dual POV. Again, your Franken outline is for the book
Yeah.
rather than for the particular character arc. Your character arc should be achieved within that Franken outline,
Yeah.
but you don't need an outline specifically for that, for the purposes that we're talking about here. If you want to do that, then that's fine, but make sure you have one that's for the book itself, and that's the one that you're working from when you're drafting, right? If you want to have little mini outlines for each individual character that you want to revisit when you're editing, like I know a lot of people that do that they'll have an outline specifically for their character that they just structure in whatever way makes sense to them, and they'll do a pass specifically for that character when they're editing. The number of passes that you do for yourself goes down in number when you're working with a publisher because you don't tend to have as much time. But if that's something that's important to you, you could always incorporate it. But yeah, this outline is for just the story as a whole. Yeah. Do you have questions on
Your 4 months of drafting, is that you writing full time?
No.
4 months.
I work full time in tech. So no, I write in the evenings, on weekdays, for about 2 hours an evening. If I'm on deadline mode like that, a lot of times it's closer to 3 hours, and I'll do some on the weekends as well. But
And do you set yourself like word targets per day or?
I don't.
amount of time?
I don't because when I am working towards a deadline, I have to get it done within that time as is. So I focus more on just the time that I'm investing in it, and I'll just kind of benchmark, right? If I'm halfway through my drafting phase and I'm not halfway through the word count that I should be aiming for, I'm not halfway through my outline, I'm not at that midpoint, then I know that I need to up my time investment. But I personally find for myself, and this is going to be a totally personal thing, but for me, fixating too much on word count is not motivating. I find it like gamifies it too much, and I want it to feel a little bit more organic than that. Sometimes I get a section that's really tough, that I'm an edit as I go kind of person as well, so I'll go back over the paragraph I just wrote, which, has its pros and cons. My drafts tend to be quite clean as a result, but it definitely takes me longer. So I might have a section that I go back over several times and I get, 1,000 words done in an evening, or I might have a day where I'm just absolutely speeding through and I get 3,000 or 4,000 words done in an evening, which is rare, but it does happen occasionally when I get in the flow. Yeah, and that's just something to experiment with. I personally find writing sprints really helpful. So every single weeknight I'm on writing sprints. I have a group that I'm in that does online writing sprints. I host them if there aren't ones already happening, where we all just say what we want to achieve, then we turn off our cameras, we do it, we come back at the end of the hour and say whether or not we achieved it. And it's just that body doubling concept, and it just, for me, makes me feel a lot more productive. But yeah, there's people in there that do word count goals, there's people in there that just say, just writing new words in this hour, and that's fine. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that a synopsis is just an outline but written out in paragraphs. In a synopsis, they want in just one page.
Yes. Now, I must say, until now, I was just talking to our friend over here about this earlier. I am, for the first time in my career, being asked to write a synopsis, and I think it's because of a new person to the team. I've always been able to work with my publisher with just an outline, right? I've never had to do a synopsis before. I'm being asked to do a synopsis for book 4. And that's going to be interesting because, yes, when you're querying, they want a synopsis to be 1 page. I think when you're working with a publisher, they tend to be less strict about that kind of thing when you're working with a publisher that you've worked with before. Because if it's a little bit over a page, what are they going to do? Tell you, no, we're not going to publish you, we're not going to uphold the second part of your book deal because your synopsis was 2 sentences too long. There are a lot of people who are smarter than me who have really good advice on structuring a synopsis. Than what I've done. I would say that you cannot write an effective synopsis if you don't have an effective outline. And that outline is forcing you to think about the causality and the pacing that they're going to be looking for in your synopsis. It's forcing that focus that they look for in your synopsis. So even if you are writing a 1-page synopsis, start with your outline. Don't start with the synopsis. And then your synopsis should be a little bit easier to write. I got no advice for cutting it down to a page because that sounds like a nightmare. Sorry, there was a wonderful session, I'm told, earlier today on how to do that, but unfortunately I didn't get to make it to that one, though it sounds like I should have. Yes.
Thanks, Sam. That was so detailed. It was absolutely gold. We were trying to hang on to every word. I remember it.
Sorry.
That's fine. You've put a smorgasbord of different techniques there, sort of established written techniques on how to outline properly. If you're new to sort of formally outlining at this scale, and I'm previously mainly short stories and the outlines are far simpler, is there an order to sort of try them in? Are there sort of 1 or 2 big beasts that you think this will give this a go first, as maybe to see if that sticks as your preferred component in your Franken outline, or would you just say try them all in any order and just see which one works best?
I would say try them all. I would say try them all in the order they're given to in the templates,
Right.
because it's forcing you to go through that more general to more detailed pipeline, which I think is really important for forcing that focus that we were talking about. I think that I actively try not to just default to the ones that I know I end up using time and time again, because I do myself a disservice. Like I said in this most recent one, Save the Cat really resonated in a way that it hadn't before. So if I had just stuck to the ones that I know I've ended up using in my Franken outline in the past, I would have missed out on the clarity that putting it into Save the Cat gave me. So I would definitely recommend doing it in that order. If you find other structures out in either, because there are hundreds, if you find other structures that are useful that you want to put into your template that you go through every single time, absolutely do that. But I'm of the opinion that every story you write, you should be going through all of those in that order.
And then sort of building on that question a little bit. So you said use what you find useful.
For your Franken
From each of
outline.
those, yeah, from each of those.
Yes.
Well, this is a bit of a weird question, but how do you decide and how do you know what you find useful? Do you know what I mean?
Ooh, how do you know what you
Trying to
find
use straight
useful?
away, or
Yeah.
does that make sense? I read
It does, yeah.
And then I was like, no, because it's, all the universe and all that doesn't fit.
Yeah.
As you're saying. So how do you?
I think you just know, because like you've just said, you knew that that didn't fit, right?
Yeah, but then I just was convinced that for like 6 months I was doing something wrong. So I just
No,
was
but
like,
it's not.
just
And-
no complication of having
But that's the purpose of having all of these in there, and that's the purpose of going through all of them. Imagine if you limited yourself to one, and then all of a sudden you found that one of the story beats just didn't make sense for you. Then you're going to think, is there something wrong with my
Yeah.
idea? Not necessarily. Try it through a few of the other structures, and you might find that there's language somewhere else that resonates more
Okay.
with you. Within the templates, I have linked for each one where there is, I think, a really valuable resource. In some instances, it's a book. For Save the Cat, it's a book. For Take Off Your Pants, it's a book. If there's a resource that will tell you in depth what each of those beats is trying to accomplish to help you better decide what plot should actually be going into each of those beats, I've included those links, and that might help you understand, is it that there is an important beat here to a story that I just don't know what to do with? Or is it that the language of what this beat is trying to achieve just isn't resonating with me for this story? Because those are two different problems, right? One is, okay, I know I need to achieve a Dark Night of the Soul, but actually on a practical level, I don't know what that looks like for my story. That's something you need to work through. That's something you need to figure out. But if it's the terminology Dark Night of the Soul and what Save the Cat is telling me needs to go in that, doesn't really resonate for me, but I can see that in Take Off Your Pants, this beat is serving the same function and that resonates more with me, then that's where you bring that in.
Yeah.
So that's how your Franken outline gets compiled.
Brilliant.
Steve, did you have one? Did you? No.
Well, the question I had was about taking the outline into a series of books.
Yes.
Because do you leave them as standalone outlines, or do you link them in some way? And does that change the content?
Yeah, I would say just like there are genre-based derivatives, there are also series derivatives of some of these things. Every single book that you write needs to have a story arc within itself, right? Nothing grinds my gears more than when I read the first in a fantasy trilogy and it just doesn't achieve everything a story is supposed to achieve, right? You get to the end and it clearly is just the first third of a story that the author's just gone on for 120,000 words. That's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to have 3 distinct story arcs that also create a lot of payoff within each other as an overarching story. So you're still gonna go through this process separately for those 3 parts of the story. You might also have some overarching stuff, and there will be resources online of how to plot those, and it's probably gonna be very specific to your genre, right? So a fantasy series, which is very duology, trilogy based, there's gonna be a lot of structures specific for that. For crime series, where you get like the detective so-and-so novels, where there's like 25 of them, right? The way that you outline an overarching plot for that is gonna be very different. So I would encourage you to focus on genre specific structures for those series.
Thank you.
From a personal point of view, when you had your Save the Cat epiphany,
Yes.
it didn't work and then suddenly it did work. Can you identify why that was? Was it a different type of thing you were trying to story-wise, or?
Why did Save the Cat work this time? I think it was the language just made more sense based on the specifics of the story I was writing. If I look at Save the Cat, I'll try to remember. Save the Cat. I think specifically it was the break into 3, right? So this is an act-based terminology. Break into 3 is about like breaking into Act 3. That happened in this book in a way that it didn't in my first 2 books and in other projects that I've outlined. There was a more distinct break into 3, and I don't want to say what exactly that is because it would spoil the book, but it just made more sense to me. And then because of that, the finale and finale image made a lot more sense as well. I've got a really strong final image beat in this book that's coming out, again in a way that my first book did, but other projects in between haven't. And that's not to say that I don't have that beat covered off, but the term final image and what that means in a Save the Cat context didn't really resonate with those projects as much.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I think that's time. Yeah, we're at time. We got to clear out really quickly. I'll hang around the foyer in case you guys have any other questions, but thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If you need the slides and stuff, here you go. So samanthaparks.com/BWF. There's going to be a password protected page. Your password is outlined, or you can scan this QR code.